Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you back. I am sorry that not more of us are in person, but those who came in person, I appreciate it. I appreciate that you got your ice skates on before Shir started. Where we are right now is in the middle of Perek Chet, Perek Gimel, I'm sorry, in Perek Gimel, Pasuk Chet. Perek Gimel, if you recall, begins in the 12th year of Achashverosh's reign. Achar hadvarim ha'elem. After these things, we dealt with all the different possibilities, what these things could be. But it is 5 years since the appointment of Esther to be the queen, the one who is the leading person, taking over after Vashti. Haman comes on the scene, unfortunately. We talked about what does it mean, Haman ben Hamdata Agagi? Was he really Amalek? Was he like Amalek? The different approaches with that as well we've dealt with, but we know that there's this confrontation that takes place between him and Mordechai. That Mordechai is Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech. Mordechai is an official in the palace, a person who sat B'Shar HaMelech in the gateway. The gateway was the place where courts sat, where other officials sat. He sat in the capital area, the area of the Acropolis of the palace of Achashverosh in the city of Shushan. And when Haman comes on the scene, Haman goes ahead and Haman wants everyone to bow down to him. There's a medrash that says he had an idol that was hanging around his neck. It was an insidious way to try to get the Jews to worship Avodah Zarah. We also talked about the possibility that that wasn't the case, primarily because another medrash also says that the Sanhedrin had bowed down, that it was only Mordechai had chosen not to bow down, and it's impossible to imagine that the Sanhedrin would have bowed down to an idol, and therefore it's yeah.
Is the Sanhedrin any of those the same people that going back, Achashverosh in this party?
So we have a lot of problems with the Midrashim. The Midrashim are all true, but the Midrashim contradict each other. And the Midrashim, and remember, whenever we deal with the Persian era in Jewish history, it gets even more complicated because we are missing those 165 years or so in history itself. And so if you remember, we go back to the time when we introduce Mordechai, okay, and Asher Heglam, Im Yechonyam, Melech Yehuda, who was exiled with Yechonyam. Was Mordechai actually this, or was it his great-grandfather who had been exiled, and we're several generations later? If we are several generations later, then the Midrashim that talk about the Sanhedrin are really complicated, because the Sanhedrin never sat in Persia. We would be speaking about an exile that had occurred immediately before this story takes place, or close enough before this story takes place, so that you could have people who were former members of the Sanhedrin sitting there. The Sanhedrin wasn't functioning, but there are other midrashim as well that also talk about that the members of the Sanhedrin actually served as advisors to Achashverosh, and that those were the Yodea Itim, the people who were talked about earlier in the story, the ones who knew times. The Sanhedrin were the ones who established the months, Rosh Chodesh, etc. So there's a lot of different pieces here, but I think the most important part of it all is to remember that with all of these different pieces, that it's very hard to chart a single definitive response. We have to notice that there are multiple approaches to understanding the Megillah, but there are some key messages that are being done. The key messages right now are going to be the message of this anti-Semitism that is arising, and Haman rising as well. We had talked even about, was Haman memuchan or not? Part of the reason behind saying that Haman was memuchan is the mere fact that he just comes out of nowhere. How do you have a person who rises so quickly without having been in the court? Another piece of Mimuchan is he's going to use some of the same language in this perek as Mimuchan had used. Im al hamelech tov, if it pleases the king. That was the same advice that Mimuchan had given regarding Vashti. And also, if you remember, regarding Vashti, his claim was that if you don't take care of this now, it's going to explode. Same thing here. That's his basic claim as well. If you don't take care of this nation, things are going to get out of control. So there are certain parallels between Mimuchan and Haman. And all of that is just a background. And ultimately, when Haman finds out that Mordechai is not bowing down to him, apparently he didn't recognize it. It had to be told to him. And then in Pasuk Hey, we said, Vayar Haman ki ein Mordechai koreh mishtachavelo, vayamaleh Haman chemam, that Haman just was burning. He was literally incensed. The fact that Mordechai wasn't bowing down to him. Vayivez beinav lishloach yad b'Mordechai levado. He couldn't, and this is still review, he couldn't imagine just attacking Mordechai, ki gidu lo et am Mordechai, because they told him where Mordechai came from. There was this enmity, there was this hatred apparently already in place. He's told Mordechai ha-Yehudi. Mordechai didn't hide that he was Jewish. He was Mordechai Yehudi, and he hears this, and he goes the next step. And then he makes the decision he's going to kill all of the Jews. And that's where we left off last week. And where we left off last week is with Pasuk Zayin. And in Pasuk Zayin, we introduce the poor. Now, if you remember this idea of the poor, of the lottery that he did, was very simple, that because of the poor, we have the name Purim, right? And it says, B'chodesh harishon hu chodesh Nisan, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan. Now, why do we need that definition? And if you recall, the names of the months came from this exile, from the Babylonian Persian exile. The names that we have of months from the Chumash are Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi'i, Chamishi, Shishi, etc., are just the numbers. When we came a little bit later in history, in the time of Sefer Melachim, we already introduced other names. Etanim and Ziv and Bul are the only three that we have that remain to us. We have to assume that there were other names for the other 9 months. When they were in the Galut, after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, then all of a sudden things change once again, and we adopt the months of the non-Jews. Why we adopted the names of the months of the non-Jews, we also have dealt with, but part of it is to remember that we are in Galut. Part of it was to remember that unfortunately we had to make some accommodation for Jews who just didn't know better. That's why also Ezra and Nehemiah changed the alphabet. So we use the Assyrian alphabet, and the original alphabet was called the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew that we read is actually an Assyrian Tavashuri. It's an Assyrian script. All of those things were happening at the same time. It is the first month. That's a Jewish definition. Hu Chodesh Nisan, which in Persia is called Nisan, not precisely what they said it called in Persia. I've seen it transliterated. It's more like Nisanu, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Bishnat 12 Melech Achashverosh. This is the 12th year of Achashverosh. He peel pur hu hagoral, and therefore he cast lots, which is called a lottery. The word pur is a Persian word. So again, just like at the beginning, when we say the first month, we're translating it into the Persian name of Nisan. Also, when we say Pur, we're translating it into a Hebrew name. And he cast lots, and he went miyom liyom, from day to day, umichodesh lechodesh, and from month to month, he's casting these lots. Until finally, it falls on the month of Adar. Now notice, we don't say what day in Adar. It's an important piece to just realize there's some ambiguity of how we get to the day of the 13th in a moment, but we'll see that in a moment, also possibilities. He casts these lots. Now, interestingly, the lottery in the time of Chumash is more like a lottery that we have today, where you cast lots, where you put little pieces of paper, or in the time, for example, the casting lots over the goats for Azazel, those were lots where they were very fancy kind of lots. It was permanent. One was La Hashem and one La Azazel, and which lot ended up on the goat's head was different. Here, he Pilpur, we know already from the excavations in the 1860s of the city of Susa, that what a pur is. A pur were really throwing of dice. So this is from a book there was actually a report of all the excavations. It's the title of the book, and I'm going to butcher it because it's in French, La Crabale de Susa. Okay, that this is from the Palace of Susa. I'll bring it online, bring it up for those who are online just to see the page as well. But for everyone else who's here, because it's in French, I didn't make copies for everyone. I apologize. Unless if your French is good, I'll be happy to do so. That he has a picture of a die, like in dice, that were found in the palace with, as now again, I apologize for my lack of pronunciation in French, but, and please don't laugh, he writes in the middle of the page, sur les facettes rectangulaires, un grave, au moins de point de nombre de frame, 1, 2, 5, 6, that it is a rectangular cube, and on the rectangular cube, there are points, just like we have a die. And so if you can imagine, this is the way they made their decisions. They would throw the dice, and they would throw the dice that they had, and that was the poor, which is really good, because if you think about, when you think about six-sided dice, they work really well if you're coming up for a 12-month setting, and you can throw it, and you maybe there's a certain number of times they threw, maybe they threw 2 die. I don't know how it went exactly, but we do know actually from archaeology that there was this kind of procedure that they had built in. That's the poor, and they found these dice. Not that these were the dice in that palace that actually Haman used, but they did find them in Susa itself. And to continue now.
Rabbi Matanki?
Yes, Barry.
What was the lottery that they were in? What were they trying to establish?
They're trying to establish, he wants to be able to determine when he is going to kill the Jewish people.
Oh, it's a time.
Okay.
When?
When. He wants to determine when. He's already determined in the previous pasuk, he's going to kill him. Now, when is it going to take place? And we'll see, he's going to talk about how it's going to take place as well. He goes up until the month of Adar, and pasuk chet. Vayomer Haman lemelech Achashverosh. Now Haman already, he has his plan. He steps into Achashverosh, and he tells him, there is this one nation, mifuzar u'miforad ben amim, who are scattered and separated among the people. Now, notice he doesn't say who this nation is. It's an anonymous nation. We don't know if Achashverosh knew it was the Jews or not. But as far as Achashverosh, the presentation Haman is making to him is, it's both, on the one hand, it's only one nation. They're scattered and spread, which could explain that they really don't have any power, or it could say that they've managed to insert themselves everywhere. And so they're all over the people. The Malbim points out that it's clear that if Haman had already started talking about who he was planning on killing, that Achashverosh might have stopped the plan, because Achashverosh knew that the Jews were well known for wisdom, for being able to provide guidance. He knew of Mordechai. There wasn't a secret that Mordechai HaYehudi, he had elevated him into this position of power. And so as a result, all of this is present. In addition, if you notice, he doesn't go ahead and say right off what he's planning on doing, but rather he's saying mifuzar mifarad ben amim. There's this almost a poetic kind of tone to what's happening. It's a tzlil nofel al tzlil, the same mem pei vav. Each one of those words start the same way. Mifuzar, in other words, they're everywhere. Mifurad, even they're not sitting in one place, even though they're everywhere. They don't have any, in a sense, there's no dignity, there's no glory to this people. They're just these ragtag people hanging out all over the place. You don't know them. That's one way of looking at it. The Ibn Ezra actually says, no, they've inserted themselves everywhere. This is the second explanation and the second nusach of the Ibn Ezra. They've inserted themselves everywhere. So you got to be careful, because it's not just a question of one nation. They've figured out how to find their positions all over. Interesting. The Ibn Ezra and the first version of the Nusach Rishon we have of the Ibn Ezra even goes a step further, that they have no sense of loyalty to one another. In other words, they're all independent. They don't have their loners. They don't have that sense of loyalty that you would want to have. The Chachmei Tzarfat again says that this is a question of how despicable these people are, because there's nobody else. There's nobody else like them. Everybody else finds their place in society. These Jews, they have no place in society. Okay, the Malbim says, again, it's a great danger having them like this. And the Rei Nachmiash actually says, there's nothing to worry about. They're just a little here and a little there. You're not going to lose anything if you get rid of these people. Not only that, in every one of your countries, v'datehem shonot mikol am. And we translate dat nowadays as a religion. Dat actually is a Persian word, and we have an English word from the same shoresh, which I only learned last night. Dat and data is from the same shoresh. Information, or in this case, dat is their laws, not the religion. Their laws are different. You see, Achashverosh didn't have a problem with different religions. That was part of the Babylonian experience. They allowed other religions to thrive and to have almost an element of self-rule as well. But their rules are different. They play by a different set of rules. And because they're playing by a different set of rules, they don't follow your rules. Now, what are your rules? Rashi says they're not giving you what's due to you. They're not paying their labor tax that they're supposed to be paying. All right. The Ibn Ezra says in the second explanation, it doesn't even make a difference what they're not doing. If you have rule X king and they do rule Y, they're rebels. They're mordei malchut, and therefore as rebels, you should kill them. V'lamelech ein shavem lahanicham. And it's not even worth leaving them there. There's nothing you get from them, the Malbim says. You don't have any benefit. If they're not paying you taxes, if they're not following your rules, if they're not a force because they're spread out everywhere, they're inconsequential to you. So notice again, what Haman is doing here is he's building up his case of why destroying this nation doesn't make a bit of difference. You want to destroy him, you destroy him, and you won't even notice the difference the next day. Im ala melech tov, and therefore, im ala melech tov, if it pleases the king, a very strange language to use when you're talking about mass murder, about genocide, but if it pleases the king, and we'll get to that idea of the genocide later, yikatev la'abdam. I want you to go ahead, and I want you to write to destroy them. Now, yikatev is in a passive form. Yikatev, it shall be written to destroy them. Why doesn't he say destroy them? Why doesn't he say give the command? Why isn't it in an active form? Says Professor Jonathan Grossman, because what Haman is trying to present to the king is he wants to remove from the king any hesitation and also a sense of responsibility. Let it be written as if you don't have to do anything. It's just going to happen on its own. Just leave it alone and watch. All of this is going to happen. So let it be written. I'm sorry. Im al melech tov yikatev la'abdam va'aseret alafim kikar kesef eshkol al yedei oseh melacha. And you will get 10,000 kikar kesef. Now, a kikar kesef, Herodotus teaches us, the great Greek historian, he teaches us in the third book, in the 95th chapter, that in the times of Daryavesh, now, Daryavesh, there were a number of Dariuses, but in the time of Daryavesh, who was either before, well, he was both before and after Achashverosh, whether we're dealing with Darius the first, the second, or the third, the entire take on annual taxes in Persia was 14,560 kikarei kesef. So in essence, what Haman is offering the king is almost an entire year's income, or 2/3 of a year's income to the Persian Empire. It's this extraordinary amount of money. It's millions and millions and millions of whatever their dollar was at that time. The Persians didn't have a coin of the same nature. They weighed their coins to make sure the value in precious metal. But he's offering this extraordinary amount of money. And part of the question is, where's this money going to come from? So the Ralbag says real simply, this money is going to come from the spoils. We kill the Jews and you're going to get all that money. So you'll get all the money from them. And the Osei Melacha, the ones who are doing the work, those are the ones who are going to be stealing the money from the Jews. All of this, by the way, this is based on the Ralbag, bases himself on a Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. The Malbim says one more time that he's trying to tell Achashverosh, look how he's phrasing it. Vaseret alafim kikar kesef eshkol al yedei oseh melacham. I'm not paying you. The guys who are doing the dirty work, who are doing the melacha, they'll be happy to give you the money. This is, in other words, again, the way the Malbim's doing it, the Malbim builds up this case, is this is an inconsequential people. They have no people to protect them. No one will miss them. And when we get rid of them, the people who get rid of them will be just thrilled to give you money because nobody wants them around. So they'll just hand off all of the money on that place. It is interesting that Dr. Mikras suggests that according to historians, there was a procedure in the times of the kings of Persia and Madai, that what they used to do is to get what you wanted from the king, you gave him a tribute. So basically you bribe him. You need something from the king, here's the present. Well, king, I want you to kill the Jews, here's a present. Again, the Jews have not been mentioned in this whole conversation. Lavi el ginzei melech, and this money is going to be brought to the treasuries of the king. Vayasar hamelech et tabato me'al yado. So Achashverosh takes off the signet ring, and that signet ring is, a powerful tool, because whoever has the seal of the king can legislate laws. So he takes off the signet ring. Don't forget that we had the same kind of thing with Paro and Yosef. Back in Sefer Breshit in Perek Mem Aleph, that Paro gave the power to Yosef, and all of these connections between the story of Yosef and the story of Megillat Esther that we've done before. But he does all of this, takes off his ring, Vayitna la Haman ben Hamdat ha'agagit tzorer hayudim, and he gives it to Haman, who is now identified as the Tzorer HaYehudim, who is the one who hates the Jews. Interestingly, in this whole thing, we don't know what Achashverosh's feeling about the Jews are. And we have two possible paths. Path number one is that Achashverosh had no clue who Haman was talking about. Now, it's hard to imagine that an advisor suggests genocide and the king who is going to allow it to happen doesn't bother to ask, by the way, what's the name of this people? It's hard to imagine it. Taking that approach is complicated. But if you look in the text, he doesn't say Jews. Nowhere does he identify the Jews. The other pathway is the pathway that Achashverosh hated the Jewish people as well. That's the Reb Nachmi Ash takes that approach, that he hated them. But the other piece of unusual evidence is, who's the Tzorer HaYehudim? Haman is the Tzorer HaYehudim. Achashverosh is never identified as a Tzorer HaYehudim, the Tsar, person who really hates us. And so again, we might go back that Achashverosh didn't hate the Jews.
Rabbi?
Maybe it was just a business deal.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
where is Danielle in all this?
Well, we don't know. Daniel, if you remember, we suggest that he was one of the advisors at the time of Vashti, that he was present at that time. Okay, but we don't see him in the picture. And again, we don't have a clear information of exactly even when this event occurred. So it could be he was there, but no longer. He was already at the end, the sunset of his career. And he had no voice on this. It could be he wasn't there anymore. It could be he had gone off in retirement. So, or had already passed away. We don't know for sure, but he isn't a player in this, except in the Medrash, as being identified as one of the original 7 advisors back in the first parak. The last point, just to suggest, Tzorer HaYehudim, and I haven't seen this, but when I was learning the parak, it hit me. Remember, one of the great challenges we have is why is it, and this is, bear with me for a moment, why is it that there is no Megillat Chashmonaim that we read? There is the book of the Maccabim 1 and Maccabim 2, but why is it that we don't have a classic reference or a classic book dealing with Hanukkah? And there's all different kinds of answers that are approached to it. One of the answers that is offered is because ultimately the Jews at the time of Hanukkah were already Jews who were not in a position of ruling themselves. Others were over them. If you remember, even the Hasmoneans, when they conquered the Seleucids to be able to free the Beit HaMikdash, it was short-lived. The Beit HaMikdash, once again, they were taken over, and ultimately, when the Maccabim were in charge, they were never independent. They were always under someone else, Greeks or Romans. And in fact, if you recall at the end of the Hanukkah story already, that the great battle between Aristobulus and his brother about who was going to be in charge, and there was this internal fight. We dealt with it when we were learning Sefer Daniel, and one of them reached out to Rome, and that's where the Romans came in. We don't have Hanukkah as a book, and with great emphasis, because it really talks about the Jewish people rising up against a ruler, defeating the ruler, and celebrating the ruler's defeat. It's not something that a Jewish people in exile want to celebrate too much. And because someone will read it and say, you can't trust these Jews. They're going to try to kill us. They celebrate every year this Hanukkah celebration where they killed the other people. When it comes to Purim, however, Purim can be because at the end of the Megillah, we read that everyone knows about this story, that the story of the Megillah was sent out to all of the countries that were under Achashverosh's control. It was something that everyone heard. We had nothing to lose. And yet at the same time, it could be that the authors of the Megillah started with Mordechai and Esther wrote it, and then the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah edited it, made sure not to assign blame to Achashverosh. Because maybe, they don't want Achashverosh to say, hey, I'm the bad guy. Achashverosh can't be the bad guy because he's going to be working with them. And so maybe they left these ambiguities here and assigned the blame clearly to Haman, because this was the way that the Jews could continue to celebrate this holiday. It's about him and not about you. It's about that one terrible person who orchestrated everything. Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayomer Hamelech laHaman. The king says to Haman, Hakesef natun lach. I don't need this money. You keep it. Now, why would he tell him to keep it? Say the Chachmei Tzorfat. The Chachmei Tzorfat say the reason he told him to keep it is because he's built up the case that these people have never been contributing members of society to begin with. They're parasitic in a way. The Jews are just nothing. They're mefuradim, mefuzar ben amim. They don't have any power. So Achashverosh says, look, if you were asking me to destroy a nation from whom I get taxes, taking Rashi's approach, from whom I have some benefit, from whom I get some income, okay, yeah, you got to make it up. Give me the money. Here, I get nothing out of it. So whether they're here or whether they're killed, I don't have any difference. It doesn't make a difference to me. You keep the money. There's something you want to do. You keep the money. And you do what you want to do. ויקראו סופרי המלך בחודש הראשון ב13 יום בו, וייכתב ככל אשר ציווה המן על החשדר פני המלך ואל הפחות. And so on the 13th day of the month, the scribes were called and they began to write documents. Now, the reason why this 13th day of the month is important, this is the first time we have a date. All that had happened in the lottery when they cast the lots was a month. We knew Adar. Now, let's assume for a moment that it took until the 13th day to get all of this negotiation with Achashverosh and all of the necessary things in place. And so it's on the 13th day of the month where it's happening. Okay, well, I have to pick a day in Adar. So let's do 11 months from today. Today's the 13th. We're sending out the notes. You got 11 months. And on the 13th day of Adar is going to be the day. And it can be as simple as that on how he picked the days. And he writes, everything was written like Haman commanded, but who's it written to? Achashtar Panei is again one of those great Persian words. And even though the Tosfos Arid wants to say that it is a contraction of words, Achash, like an Achashverosh, meaning great, and Dar is a person who sits, and Panei is Panim, so it's the great person who sits before the king, the Ibn Ezra rejects it. And he just says this is a Persian word, Achashtar Panei, who in English we refer to them as satraps. It's a level of a ruler, like a ve'el pachot, and to the pachot in English we refer to them as pasha. In India, they had pashas. So these are the different kinds of governors. He writes them to the Achashtar Panei HaMelech and to the Pachot, Asher al Medina, Vel Sarei Am. He writes to each of the countries and every people who are responsible for every nation. Medina kichtava. He wrote it in all of the different languages. V'am kilshono. B'shem hamelech Achashverosh. It was nichtav. It was written in the name of the king. V'nachtam b'tabat hamelech, and it was sealed by the tabat hamelech. Now the Malbim has another interesting approach on this. The Malbim says, listen, he's writing it to two groups of people: the Achashtar Panim and to the Pachot. Why doesn't he just write to one or the other? And he explains that actually he's writing two different documents. There was one document that spelled out things explicitly. Those were to the officials who were the closest to him. And then there was another document that was sent to the general public. This is the Vilna Gaon's approach as well, that did not explain directly what he wanted to do. Because if you want to kill an entire nation, you want to commit genocide, you normally don't put up posters on the wall saying in 11 months from now, we're going to kill all the Jews. Because there are two issues. One is, as the Vilna Gaon points out, you don't want the Jews to run away. If you want to kill them, you want to catch them a little bit off guard. But number two is, and this we found even going back to Paro and going forward to the 20th century, when you want to commit a horrific act, it takes time first to diminish that people in the eyes of others so they don't feel it's murder, but rather it's just getting rid of a problem. If you remember in Shmot Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud, there's a famous Ramban on the words, Hava nitchak malo, let's deal wisely. And there the Ramban lays out all the steps that Paro took to convince the population of Egypt that the Jews, to use a modern term, were Untermenschen, were subhuman. The same thing we found in the 20th century with the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, and the same thing you find, by the way, with any time one people wants to control or one people wants to destroy another people. It's not, unfortunately, the Jewish experience has been throughout, but other nations have suffered the same types of faith. You want to kill somebody, you have to prove that they're lesser than you are. Otherwise, if they're equal to you, how can you kill another human being? Yeah, Yafa.
So if we could just look back at Pasuk Yud, there's an introduction there that we have not seen this phrase before, where it says Ha'agagit Sorer HaYehudim. Why was that put in there? And what is it supposed to mean to, does it mean something to Achashverosh, to his awareness? Does it mean something to the awareness of the public around Haman Ha'agagi? Or is it just for the sake of us, the reader?
So I don't, again, I'm taking the approach that it's for us, the reader, or for whoever the reader is, that Haman has now reached a new level. In the past, he was Agagi. He was related to Amalek. And now he has earned himself the title of the Tzorer HaYudim. And what I'd also suggested that he earned the title and not Achashverosh, even though Achashverosh gave him the ultimate permission, because maybe either Achashverosh was unaware, somewhat innocent in this, or the authors of the Megillah are trying not to blame Achashverosh because of the challenges that would create the future generations of Jews. So I think it's one of those two. Shoshi, yeah.
So my view of Achashverosh is that he's a bit of a paranoid man, a king, right? He was scared of the people around him. That's why he had the officers who were helping him. Why would he offer Haman 10,000 kikars kesef when his whole monies that he brought in was only 14,560? He's making this man equal to him, which would seem to me very scary as a king.
Right. So if you recall, and I'm going to go back to last week to Rav Bachrach, Yoshua Bachrach, Rav Bachrach had suggested, Rav Bachrach, that after the incident of Bigtan and Teresh, of the two officials who were plotting to kill Achashverosh, that Achashverosh became a bit paranoid. And he wanted somebody to be his front person. He didn't want to go out of the palace anymore. He wanted to stay in the safety of his inner chambers. And therefore, that's why, Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela, according to Bachrach, that's why Haman is appointed at this point and given this level of power. And just as Lahavdil, Potiphar Paro gave the power to Yosef to run the economy of Egypt. And it was more than the economy of Egypt. It was really the entire society. If you remember, Yosef was able to purchase all of the lands of the Egyptians. Yosef gave special power to the priests, where he didn't take away their property. He gave them the grain without it, which may, by the way, have been the reason why Shevet Levi, according to Chazal, we know were not enslaved. It may have been that by Yosef showing that special respect to the priests of Egypt, it became ingrained in the society that a priestly class has special benefit. So we know that such a thing does happen. We've had it, in a lesser extent in American politics, because we don't have the absolute ruler. You don't have a monarch in the same sense, but we've seen it throughout history where a monarch will choose to be inside and let somebody else run their operation. And that's what Haman was doing. Yeah, and it's extreme. Now, the giving of the 10,000 doesn't, so on one hand, he's not ever equal, but he is elevated above everyone else. Gidal HaMelech, right? Remember, he gave them vast wealth. That's the way we talk about that terminology at the beginning of the parak. So he gave it to him. And a one-time payment of 10,000 kikar kesef. If I'm going to say that Achashverosh wasn't really in this plot, on the one hand, it could be like, here's the bounty. Enjoy it. You're doing me a favor. You're getting rid of these despicable Jews. But let's assume it's not that. It still is a one-time payment, a vast amount. But it's a one-time payment, and Achashverosh's money is coming in every year, and Achashverosh still has the power. But still at the same time, to argue a little bit more for you, Achashverosh, when you give over the signet ring, that's even worth more than the money. You're giving the power to legislate. And that giving the power to legislate is a scary power, and Achashverosh did it willingly. So once he gives over the signet ring, the fact that he also gives him a lot of money isn't as troubling to me. He gave him all the power, and with the power, he was able to get the money in that way. To move on a little further, and we're doing okay today. I think we may actually finish this parak because it's not that much longer. And so there could be, and where we had left off, if you remember, there could be two different kinds of letters that were sent out. One letter that was explicit, and it was Nechtam b'Tabat HaMelech, and it was sealed. Doesn't even mean necessarily that they read the letter. It could be open this letter at a later date. And the other could have been a little more public, because we see v'nishloach svarim biyad haratzim. They sent these letters out with the messengers. El kol medinot hamelech. This is pasuk Yud Gimel, to all of the countries of the king. Lashmid laharog ulabed et kol hayudim minar vad zaken, to kill destroy the Jews, from young to old, taf and ashim, babies, women, biyom echad, on one day, all on one day. And it'll all happen on the 13th day of Adar. And at the same time that we told people, hey, whoever you kill, you get to keep their property. So there's a motivation for people to do this. Did everyone know or not know? We don't know. In other words, it could be, and it, excuse me, as the Vilna Gaon will say in the next pasuk as well, it could be that there were these posters hung up around all of the cities that said, be ready for the 13th of Adar, something big is going to happen, just like that. And the officers, some of them received explicit information, and some of them said, open this on the 13th of Adar. It was sealed. All of that would seem to make sense psychologically on how to destroy a nation as opposed to being upfront. Yeah, Yafa.
So there is a new thing again that's introduced in Yud Gimel that wasn't there in Tess. Im al hamelach tov yikasev la'abdam. Doesn't say a word about lahashmid, laharog, la'abed. It just says la'abed, la'abdam. Now we have two more verbs, lahashmid, laharog, ula'abed. So what was la'abed to begin with, and what's the introduction of this?
Yeah, so it seems to be, again, there are two different audiences to these commands. The first time back in Tet, it's just to the king. He's keeping it simple. He isn't going into any detail. By the way, you want to make your case, you say, I want to destroy the people. If you start saying, I want to utterly destroy these people, I want to kill the babies, I want to kill the women, I want to destroy, there the king might take a step back, unless if we say he was a real anti-Semite, Achashverosh. He could take a step back. So Haman is making his plea to the king different than he's making the plea to the people he has control over. He's the Mishneh LaMelech, he's not the Melech. So to upwards, he has to minimize. Downwards, he has to be very explicit. And I think that's part of it. And I think also part of it is there is a shock value when we're reading this as well, the extent to which Haman is going for. And the fact that he's doing all of this leaves no question in our minds what this Haman is. So it continues and it says in Pasuk Yudalid, Patshegen haktav. Patshegen again is, Rashi says, Persian word, okay? The text. The Patshegen hatav linaten dat b'chol medina u'medina, to give a law. Remember, dat is not religion, dat is law. Galui l'chol ha'amim, which should be explicit to everyone. Liot atidim liyom hazeh, to be prepared for this day. Atidim is a future, right? Like atid. I want you to be ready for this day. Now, according to the Vilna Gaon, he's saying liot atidim just means be ready on the 13th. There's something you're going to have to do, but we don't tell them beferish what is going to be. And again, according to the Grum, that what this leads to is actually the next pasuk, where we're talking about at the end, Vayir Shushan Navocha. Navocha, mavuch is what's a good word for it? Navocha, a good word is
Bewildered.
bewildered. Thank you. Bewildered. There's confused is what I was thinking. Why? Well, this is the Vilna Gaon. If all people know is be ready for the 13th of Adar for instructions, what's going on? Nobody knows what's happening. Vayir Shushan Navocha. We just don't get it. And it also plays into, obviously, it plays into the psychology, because he's now got 11 months to build up to that destruction of the Jewish people, to get them in a place where they're willing to do something that on the 13th day of Nisan, when the order is first given, may be beyond what any of them could ever imagine. He needs this additional time to build up. Haratzim yatsu, and with this we're going to end. The messengers go out. The chufim, they're pushed out. In other words, this is fast. Bidvar Hamelach. Notice it's the word of the king, not the word of Haman. This is the instruction of the king. Did the king give this instruction? No. The king, it really fulfilled what goes back, if you remember to the phrase, Yikatev Labdam, let it be written that they should be destroyed. So it goes back to it. The king is a passive player. He's given his permission to Haman to do what Haman thinks is right. He knows that Haman wants to destroy a nation. He doesn't necessarily know which nation it is. He doesn't know the consequence of it. He knows there's a lot of money that you can make out of the deal. Okay. And he doesn't even want any money. Now, maybe he doesn't want the money because maybe he doesn't want any blood money. Maybe he doesn't want to have any blame. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And it could be, again, because the authors of the Megillah are trying to protect Achashverosh. And it could be because the Gemara itself still says there's a machloket. Is Achashverosh Melech Pikeach, a very wise king? Well, if he's trying to keep his distance, maybe he's very wise. Or is he Melech Tipesh? Or is he stupid, foolish? We don't know which one he is. And there are ways to read the text, both that he's very wise or that are very stupid. And that machloket was never determined. But right now we know that this command is going out with the king's imprimatur on it. It's got a seal on it. It's the king's order. It's not Haman's order. V'hadat nitna b'Shushan HaBirah. And the order is given in Shushan HaBirah. Now, remember, Shushan HaBirah is the palace and the fortress of the palace. There was Ha'ir, the city of Shushan, and there was the Birah. A Birah literally in modern Hebrew is capital. I mentioned this before. Birah is capital in modern Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, a Birah is still a fortress. So the fortress was where the palace was, or the Acropolis. And we're going to use a little bit of a different word as well. So the command was given in Shushan HaBirah, V'hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtot. And Haman and the king sat down to drink. The Yalkut Shimoni says, what do you mean they sat down to drink? The Yalkut Shimoni says this is a punishment. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shvatim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to the brothers, the shvatim, Atem machartem achichem mitoch ma'achal u'mishteh. You sold your brother Yosef, and you sat down and ate and drank. Shneimar vayashvu le'chol lechem. It's Breshit Lamed Zayin. Harei Haman lokeach etchem mitoch ma'achal u'mishteh dichtiv v'hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtot. Your punishment, as you're going to see at some point in future, what you did was, in essence, what the Medrash is saying, what the brothers did was so cruel when they sold Yosef and they sat and they ate and they drank, that the only other parallel to it is Haman, is the ultimate of our enemies, who sat and drank when he gave the command to kill all the Jews. That's the Medrash. Interestingly, the Maharal takes a very different approach on this. The Maharal says that this order of genocide is so antithetical to human nature that at this point, the only response that Achashverosh and Haman could have is to get drunk. They put out an order that should be that's inhuman. And the only way you can move forward is if you sit and you drink and you somehow turn it around. We're giving a level of humanity to Haman and to Mordechai, Haman and Achashverosh in this command, which is a fascinating piece, according to the Maharal. Of course, the Chachmei Tzorfat say what we're more familiar with. They celebrated. We did, Achashverosh says, okay, Haman, look, we got what you think it's necessary. We're doing it. Let's sit and we drink. Va'ir Shushan Navocha. So I already mentioned the Vilna Gaon, who says they were totally bewildered because they don't know exactly what's going on. It's not the palace. It's the ear. It's the population. It's the other people. Where the Jews lived, we're in the ear Shushan, the city of Shushan, not in the palace of Shushan. It says the Ibn Ezra in this, that this is also the difference why Mordechai understands more, because Vadat Nikna b'Shushan Habira. The law was explicit in Shushan Habira, and in the palace knew what was going on. The city didn't know what was going on. Mordechai sat in Shushan Habira. He was sitting b'Shar HaMelech. So Mordechai knew what was going to happen. The rest of the people only thought something is going to happen, and they didn't know what that something was going to be, which leads us right into the next parak. And we just look in the first pasuk, Mordechai yadad kol asher na'asa. Mordechai knows exactly what's going on. Vayikra Mordechai et begadav, and therefore he tears kriya. Vayilbash sakvefer, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes. Vayitzei betoch ha'ir, and Mordechai leaves the palace and he goes into the city. Vayizak zaka gedola umara, and he begins to cry. So we see how those two places are very, very important to us. If you remember in the excavations, and I'd shown you some diagrams of the excavations, they were separated. The palace area was on one hill, actually on two hills, and on a separate hill was where the city was. So Mordechai left the Shar HaMelech, goes into the city. He knows what Haman is up to. The rest of the people were just confused. And now he's going to start enlightening them and teaching them as well. Next week, we'll be back. We'll be starting Perek Dalid, and we'll continue that way. I hope I'll see more people by next week. It won't be icy out. I understand that if we read from right to left, today's temperature is kind of cold, but yesterday was 71. If we read from right to left, and hopefully next week will be a nice temperature without the ice. Everyone have a good week.
Have a good week. Thank you.